Hi everybody, welcome to Laboratory 5 where we're talking about ligaments of the upper body. So specifically in this laboratory we're going to focus on the vertebral column ligaments, the shoulder and the elbow. Now in general, ligaments join bone to bone and they do so at various landmarks. So some of these landmarks we've already learnt, we're going to cover them in a little bit more detail as well today. What we're also going to do is talk about the way ligaments restrict movement. So it's not like a muscle where a muscle can contract and make something move. Ligaments have very little give relative to a muscle and they restrict the way we move. So sometimes if we're moving one way, it's a ligament on the other side of the body that would restrict it by pulling taut or tight to not allow us to go that way. So they stabilise joints because they're joining bones to bone, stabilising these joints together, but they're also restricting the way we move. And these are the two main functions of ligaments. But in certain areas they may have other roles as well, and we'll talk of that. So we're going to start with the vertebral column. So here we've just got an example of two lumbar vertebrae with the disc represented in blue in between. Now there's 6 ligaments of the vertebral column that we have to learn today, but it's probably one of the few ligament descriptions that we don't have an actual model for. So we're going to do a lot of this using the pictures here as opposed to models with ligaments on it. So the 6 ligaments of the vertebral column we have to learn are in your book. I'm going to present them here in no particular order, but they're all presented there for you. And then we're going to end up drawing a diagram of this. But before we draw the diagram, we'll have a look at them on the screen. So this is the vertebral column looking at it from the lateral view. So you're looking at someone's side on here. You can see the spinous processes out the back. We see the disc, as I mentioned before, sitting between the two bodies of the vertebrae. Now, what movements we think about occurring at the vertebral column, we can flex, we can extend, we can hyperextend, which is back beyond our midline or going behind us. We can also lateral flex, which we'd use a different view if we were going to represent lateral flexion. So, in general, if I'm going to be flexing forward, there's going to be ligaments behind which are restricting that movement. If I'm going to be hyperextending backwards, there's going to be ligaments in front which is going to be restricting this movement. So we'll just start with the first one and say the anterior longitudinal ligament. Now it gets its name anterior because it's in front of the body, so it's anterior to the body. It's longitudinal because it travels from the top of the vertebral column all the way down to the bottom. So anterior longitudinal ligament. So you see it here, it's traveling just down the front of the bodies. Now, it's going to play a role if we thought about restricting movement. It's in front of the bodies. Therefore, if I were to bend forward, nothing's really going to happen with that ligament. It's just going to go lax. But if I hyperextend back, it's going to pull tight and restrict that. So anterior longitudinal ligament restricts movement in hyperextension. But with the vertebral column ligaments, some of them have a role in stabilizing the joint and holding in this disc. So if we were to hyperextend backwards, it's the anterior longitudinal ligament that would prevent the disc from shooting forwards. So you could call that limits or prevents anterior displacement of the disc. So anterior longitudinal ligament limits hyperextension and prevents or limits forward displacement or anterior displacement of the intervertebral disc. Likewise, we've got the posterior longitudinal ligament. Posterior coming from behind the body of the vertebrae. So it's behind the body, which means if you flex now, it would limit flexion. It would pull tight or taunt when you flex forward. Some people might have thought automatically hyperflexion, but thinking about what hyperflexion actually would be, that would be like bending over and putting your head between your legs and keep going. So we don't typically hyperflex in the trunk or spine area. So posterior longitudinal ligament, posterior to the body, and longitudinal because it's a long ligament that travels from the top all the way to the bottom. It would limit flexion, but it would also limit posterior displacement of the intervertebral disc. So as we bend forward, the disc is going to want to protrude backwards into the spine, which would be running just behind the body, and it would limit that movement. The third one we'll show in this plane is the ligamentum flavum. Ligamentum flavum travels down the posterior wall, if you like, of the vertebral foramen. So the back of the hole that's running down the vertebral columns from top to bottom. Now, ligament infrabum is a broken ligament. So that means it's not one long one like the other two we just mentioned. It's little one that goes from the lamina of a vertebrae to the lamina of another vertebrae. Remembering what the lamina is those two sort of flat surfaces either side of the spinous process. But in this case, it's on the inside of the lamina. So the inside posterior wall, broken, going down from one lamina to another lamina on the posterior wall of the intervertebral or vertebral foramen. So again, it's behind the bodies, therefore the ligament infrabum would also limit flexion of the vertebral column. So the three of them, if we looked at this in a cross-sectional view, so now we're looking on top, you'll notice the anterior longitudinal ligament is travelling right around the front or anterior surface of that. So it's a much bigger ligament in the vertebral column compared to all the other ligaments. It's really big, it wraps around. It's the only one that occurs in front of the vertebral column. Therefore, it's the only one that limits hyperextension. You see the posterior longitudinal ligament, it's smaller, but it's also long, so it's running right away from the top all the way to the bottom. And then you've got the ligament infrabum just on the inside of these lamina here, which is either side of the spinous process, but travelling in short bursts down between each of the lamina. So, it's a difficult one to look at from this view, but we've got the intertransverse ligament. It's difficult because the transverse process of the vertebrae is sticking out the side. So, intertransverse ligament is travelling from a transverse process of a vertebrae to another transverse process of the vertebrae. Again, it's a broken one, skipping from transverse process to transverse process. Now, being on the sides of our body, they would limit lateral flexion. In other words, if I wanted to flex my trunk to the right, it would be the ones on my left that pull tight and limit it. Again, if I wanted to go to my left, it would be the ones on the right that pull tight and limit that. So a broken ligament, inter coming for in between, transverse process of the vertebrae. We've got the spinous processes coming out the back and an interspinous ligament going between, again word inter, between spinous process of the ligament. So it's quite a large ligament that travels between each of the spinous process. So inter between spinous process, interspinous ligament. It's behind, again, so it would limit flexion of the spine. Likewise, the supraspinous ligament, which again, if we see that spinous word, it's on the spinous process. Superior meaning, or supra meaning above or on, if you like, the spinous process. So it travels down the tip of the spinous process, again limiting flexion of the spine. So I've said flexion a lot, there's literally all the ones behind limiting this flexion process, which is quite a lot of them, compared to this one on the front, which was that anterior longitudinal. So, those three in a nutshell, we see all six that we have to learn. Again, so limits hyperextension, limits flexion, but also has that role in holding that disc in. See the ligament infrabum also limiting flexion. The intertransverse ligament limiting that lateral flexion. And then the two at the back, the interspinous ligament and the supraspinous ligament, also limiting that flexion as well. So now we're going to have a quick look at a model of this and look at where it would fit on a model just to put it in a little bit more perspective and then show you how to draw it in your lab books. So we'll start by looking at this thoracic vertebrae. We know it's a thoracic vertebrae because it's got the pointed down spinous process and the two facets, superior articulating facets in the coronal or frontal plane. We've got the body of the vertebrae here, remembering that this is the lamina, but also the lamina is on the inside of that wall as well, which will become important, the vertebral foramen being the hole that runs straight down the middle of the vertebrae. We'll start by drawing these ligaments, and you've got a space in your book where you can follow along of the vertebrae. I'll draw the vertebrae from side on and also from a front on view so we can try and label each of these vertebrae. So, let's start with something like this. I've got something like that. Pretty good, happy with that. So two vertebrae, in between the body of the vertebrae we have our intervertebral disc. Right, so we'll start by drawing the anterior longitudinal ligament. The anterior longitudinal ligament travels down the anterior surface of the bodies from the top all the way to the bottom.
The posterior longitudinal ligament is traveling down the posterior surface. It's inside of the hole, so you wouldn't see it there, but it'd be traveling down through the middle, right the way from the top to the bottom. And remember, these have their movement options as well. So the anterior longitudinal ligament will limit hyperextension. So if I'm bending backwards towards the spinous process, that ligament's going to pull tight, and not allow us to move that direction very much. And the anterior longitudinal ligament is also going to limit this anterior displacement of the intervertebral disc. So as we hyperextend back, the disc is going to want to protrude forward. Anterior longitudinal ligament is going to help prevent that. Posterior longitudinal ligaments traveling down the back surface of the body. So it is going to limit flexion and also limit posterior displacement of the intervertebral disc. We've got the ligamentum flavum, which will be traveling, a broken ligament traveling down between the lamina, so inside that foramen. So this spiral here representing the foramen that's running down. Ligamentum flavum is running between each of the lamina of the adjacent vertebrae down the posterior wall of the intervertebral foramen. It too is going to limit flexion. And then we have the interspinous ligament traveling between the spinous process of the vertebrae. It too is going to limit flexion. And then the supraspinous ligament, remember that supra coming from the word on top or above, it's coming on top of each of these tips of the spinous process, also limiting flexion. So from this view, we've got the anterior longitudinal ligament limiting the hyperflexion, and then each of these behind limiting flexion. So posterior longitudinal ligament, ligamentum flavum, interspinous ligament, and supraspinous ligament. Now, if I draw the vertebrae from the front view to help capture that intertransverse ligament, so we would see a vertebrae from the front view looking something like this. You've got the transverse processes sticking out the side. You might have the facets up the top, something like that. And the bottom, you see these two come together. The intervertebral disc would again be between. Right, if I draw my intertransverse ligament, it would go between the transverse process of each vertebrae, another broken ligament traveling from transverse process to transverse process, and they would limit lateral flexion on the opposing side. So if I wanted to laterally flex this way, it would be this one here that limits the lateral flexion. If I wanted to laterally flex this way, it would be this one here that limits the lateral flexion.
So now we're going to have a closer look at ligaments of the shoulder. So we see models like this with ligaments all over it. In order to learn these, we're going to have a closer look at some of these bony landmarks. So ligaments of the shoulder, we'll have a look under the microscope and see what the bony landmarks look like, and then we'll incorporate the ligaments in their movements.
So here we're looking at a scapula, looking at the bony landmarks for revision. We know the scapula is a flat bone, and we're looking at the right side of the scapula. I know we're looking at the right side by acknowledgement of the bony landmarks. So again, we're looking at the front because it's just got this nice fossa, so the subscapular fossa on the front. On the back, we've got the spine running across the back here, so we know this is the front. And you've got the socket to determine medial from lateral, so this is the glenoid cavity on the lateral side. So this is the front, lack of spine, and the glenoid cavity. These two are really important landmarks to recall. We've got this one on the front here called the coracoid process. We look at it from the side view. It's the smaller one that's slower than this one here, which is called the acromion. So coracoid process, acromion, and glenoid cavity are three really key landmarks. Now, the other thing we need to look at here is we're acknowledging where this is that. So this is the right scapula. Would go like that on there. So we can see that's the coracoid process, the same as that there. That's really important because, like the joints, these ligaments share a lot of the same names of the two bony landmarks that they're connecting to and from. So there's 5 we have to learn on this shoulder ligament model. And if we remember the coracoid process, the acromion, the glenoid cavity, and of course the humerus fits into that glenoid cavity, that helps us remember where these landmarks are. Of course, the clavicle connecting to the acromion up here. So when I look, first thing we'll identify those landmarks. So we're looking at the front of a scapula, a right scapula. we've got the coracoid process here, we've got the acromion here, you can see it on top, the clavicles coming and connecting to that acromion, and the humerus down here. So the 5 that we need to know are we're joining these landmarks together. So from the coracoid process to the acromion, we've got the coracoacromial ligament. From the coracoid process to the clavicle, we've got the coracoclavicular ligament. And from the acromion to the clavicle, we've got the acromio-clavicular ligament. So it was coracoacromial, coracoclavicular, and acromio-clavicular. It's this little circle of ligaments, if you like. So these two attaching the clavicle to the scapula, and this here connecting these two bones of the scapula, and essentially making like a roof for this humerus fitting into that glenoid cavity. So here from the top view, we see how it's this nice circle of ligaments here. This one here, the coracoacromial, just connecting the 2 points of the scapula together. Then you've got the acromio-clavicular and the coracoclavicular attaching to the clavicle. And if we look deep inside, we've got one here going from the very inside of the coracoid process. Seeing it from all sort of different views. It's not this part of the coracoid process, but it's really deep and attaches to the top of the humerus. That's called the coracohumeral ligament. So from the coracoid process to the humerus. And then if we look wrapping around, you see it great from the bottom view here, it wraps all the way around the glenoid cavity and attaches to the humerus. That is called the glenohumeral ligament. The only thing we haven't mentioned on here is this sort of one that's coming down here with this sort of no end to it. It sort of looks like it's kept going. Every time you see these with no end, looks like they're continuing on a model. These are tendons. So this one here is not actually a ligament of the shoulder. This is actually one of the origins of the bicep brachii. So when we're talking about ligaments, any one that looks continuous, that doesn't have a sort of an end point, looks like it's going. See, these all end, whereas this one here keeps going. That's a tendon. So we'll talk about that in muscle type weeks, but not to worry about that in the ligaments. So the first thing you have to do is label the ligaments presented on your page of the shoulder girdle. Now you'll notice there's only 3 arrows when you are labeling these ligaments, yet we've got 5 ligaments here to choose from. So which 3 are they? A little hint to this question is to look at what bone might be missing, and that might help you determine which these 3 ligaments have to be. Now we're going to move to the roles of the ligaments. So when you look at your page, you've got locate the following landmarks, ligaments of the shoulder joint. First thing we want to do is just break down those words just to ensure we really know what each one of these is. So the first one is coracoacromial on your page. Coracoacromial again is from the coracoid process to the acromion. What is the role of this ligament? Well, it's creating a roof for this shoulder joint to prevent this humerus from sliding upwards, right? So the way we can say that is to prevent superior dislocation, and we'll show you that without the ligaments. So just imagine now the humerus is sitting here in this glenoid cavity. It's preventing that from happening. So the humerus sliding out through the top. So it prevents superior dislocation. The role of the next 2, so breaking down the words, we've got the coracoclavicular, so coracoid process to clavicle, ensuring those 2 words, coracoclavicular and the acromioclavicular. These both have the same roles, which is essentially helping the clavicle and the scapula to move together. And this works in conjunction with the joints. If we talked about what movements occur between the scapula and clavicle, what we're really asking is what are the movements of the shoulder girdle. So the shoulder girdle can elevate and depress, and it can also protract and retract. So when you're doing those movements, they're not movements at the humerus, they're movements at the shoulder girdle. And you'll notice even if you just do those 4 movements yourself, elevation, depression, protraction and retraction, you'll notice that your scapula and your clavicles move together. So those 2 ligaments, the coracoclavicular and the acromioclavicular, are responsible for the movements of the scapula and clavicle moving as one unit for elevation, depression, protraction and retraction. Leaving us with the 2 ligaments that attach to the humerus. The first one being the coraco. Again, it's the really deep part of the coracoid process out to the top of the humerus. That one there, remember, it's restricting movements in the opposite direction, and as it's on top, it's going to restrict downward movements. So this actual ligament, although it doesn't look anywhere near as big as this glenohumeral ligament, it's actually a very, very strong ligament, and it is the main ligament that holds up the weight of your entire arm. So a very important ligament for holding up the weight of your arm. The glenohumeral ligament, which travels right around the entire glenoid cavity, is actually a relatively weak ligament. Whilst it looks nice and impressive in here, it's traveling all the way around. It's really thin and quite weak. Sometimes it doesn't even exist in people. But rather than just thinking, what, like it doesn't exist, I don't understand, it's better to think of this ligament as part of the joint capsule. So it's forming part of the joint capsule that's wrapping around our whole shoulder. So when I say it doesn't exist, it doesn't mean that there's nothing there. Sometimes a capsule contains ligaments. Sometimes these ligaments look more like a fibrous capsule, and sometimes they look more like a ligament. So it's not like there's nothing here at all. It just means it's really weak and it forms part of a capsule, which sometimes leads more towards the ligament and sometimes leans more towards a fibrous capsule. They're actually made out of very similar substances. So it plays a major role, or not a major, it plays a role in stabilizing the shoulder joint, but it's otherwise quite weak.
So now we'll have a look at the ligaments of the elbow. Again, we'll look at the individual bones and their bony landmarks, and then we'll incorporate the ligaments and where they fit onto those bony landmarks and talk about the different movements they restrict.
So when we're learning the ligaments of the elbow, we first need to identify our bones and what they look like. So if I asked you, what is the name of this bone, when you can only see that, what would you say? Have a think about it. What is the name of that bone? If you said ulnar, you'd be correct, and seeing it from the other view, it is much easier because you've got the U of the ulnar. But we like to identify it from this end as well, because sometimes it's covered in the model, which I'll show you in a second. So we reinforce that the ulnar has this nice U, and also it's very sharp and small at this end. It's quite different to the radius, which is opposite. It's got a smaller round end, it's complete spherical end, and then it's got a much larger end. And these two sit side by side, looking at that little radial groove there, where it can slit inside like this. So at the elbow end, we have a lot more of the ulnar making up that elbow joint with the radius just coming up to it. And at the other end, we've got the two styloid process of the ulnar and radius, with the radius being much larger at this end and forming part of that radiocarpal joint, which is our wrist joint. So the reason I asked us to identify the ulnar and radius just looking at the ends is because when we look at the ligament model for the elbow, it's hard to see that U of the ulnar and stuff when it's covered by so much. But if I look at the ends, a lot easier to see that this is the ulnar because it's got the smaller end, and this is the radius. And as we pronate and supinate, we can see that the radius is pivoting around inside this ligament here, which we'll learn in a moment, to pronate and supinate. So there's our pronation and supination, and we notice that the radius is really just pivoting on its long axis to allow that pronation and supination to occur. So we'll look at the ligaments, and we'll do the two collateral ligaments first, the ulnar collateral ligament and the radial collateral ligament. So all I need to do is identify the sides. So this is the ulnar collateral ligament. I'll just find the ulnar because I've identified it from this end here with the shorter or spiky end. And all of this ligament here on this side, so ulnar side ligament if you like, goes from the humerus down, attaches to the ulnar. So it's quite a big ligament there. On the other side, we've got a triangular type structure. Coming down from the humerus, these two that split in half, that is our radial collateral ligament. So it splits in two. It's the two parts of this triangle, not the third one. It's the radial collateral ligament. So from the humerus down, and it actually meets what we call the annular ligament. So you would say for the annular ligament, it's wrapping around the head of the radius. And the annular ligament, that bottom part of the triangle, is what creates that pivot joint, that proximal radial-ulnar joint where the pronation and supination can occur. So we touched on this joint in a previous lab, this proximal radial-ulnar, but now we're actually naming the ligament which is wrapping around to create that pivot joint. So there's only 3 ligaments on this model. You've got the ulnar collateral ligament, the radial collateral ligament splitting in 2, and then the annular ligament, which merges into the bottom of this radial collateral ligament, wrapping around the head of the radius. So when we talk about roles of these ligaments, the 2 collateral ligaments are really just limiting that medial and lateral motion, right? So they're stabilizing the elbow joint and limiting that motion. Whereas the annular collateral ligament has a much more definitive role, which is creating that pivot joint, allowing the pronation and supination to take place. You're also asked to determine what the factors affecting the stability of joint are, and rather than just naming the factors, it'd be nice to do them in order. So the factors that you have to ask yourself is, this joint, is it quite stable? Does it hold up quite well? Do many people dislocate their elbow compared to, say, shoulder joints or joints of your finger and things like that? So the answer is it's quite a stable joint. And the reason it's quite a stable joint is because of the articulating bones. So you take the articulating bones, we've got the U of the ulna here, that nice shape of the U, the shape of that articulating surface fitting into the humerus creates a lot of stability. So the number one factor for the elbow is the shape of the articulating surfaces. Anywhere where it's really nicely locking into a bone like that, the bones are going to come first in terms of stability. Secondly and thirdly, you've got the ligaments and the muscles. So the ligaments we just learnt, the muscles we'll learn later. Ligaments being the second factor contributing to stability, and muscles and the muscle tendons, which are going to cross this joint, coming in third. Things like atmospheric pressure is not so great in this because it's not like one of those deep sockets like we see in the hip. So atmospheric pressure is down the list, and skin and fibrous connective tissue is always there, is always a factor, but nowhere near the factors to stability that the bones, the ligaments, or the muscles. So if you were going to put them in order, you would say shape of the articulating surface, ligaments, the bones and muscles and muscle tendons crossing over this joint, and then in 4th and 5th in no particular order, skin and fibrous connective tissue and atmospheric pressure. So that's it for ligaments of the upper body. So just couple of key take-home messages. We had to learn the ligaments of the vertebral column, shoulder and elbow. In doing so, however, we also revised a lot of those bony landmarks. So we should be becoming more familiar with the bony landmarks, and then also learning what these ligaments are. Don't forget those vertebral column ligaments. It's easy to forget because there's no active model of these ligaments, but it's just as important as the shoulder and elbow.